James Bond is one of the most iconic movie roles of all time, and we've seen 6 different actors pick up this legendary mantle in live action across 25 films thus far. But today I'm going to be answering a very simple, yet loaded question. Of all these charming, sharp-dressed special agents, who played the best James Bond? Now, I'm only going to be considering actors who portrayed James Bond in multiple films, so respects to George Lazenby, but I just don't think we got to see enough of him in this role to strongly consider him as the GOAT. I've seen almost every James Bond film during my days, but as a refresher for this video, I rewatched what everyone wildly considers to be the 2 or 3 best films starring each of the 5 James Bond actors who portrayed the character in multiple outings. And I personally would have considered myself a casual fan of James Bond prior to this. I had seen almost all the films, enjoyed most of them even, but I didn't really have a strong opinion on this topic going into my rewatching and research. So Connery, Moore, Dalton, Brosnan, and Craig all had a fair shot at being crowned the greatest James Bond of all time by yours truly. And I know a lot of these style of videos only discuss their favorite version of the character in detail, but I'm not a typical YouTuber, so I'll be giving you at least some brief thoughts on every iteration of the character that I revisited, starting with my least favorite and culminating with the actor who is the Screen Story certified pick as best James Bond. Kicking things off, my least favorite 007 is unfortunately Roger Moore. And just for reference, I rewatched Live and Let Die and The Spy Who Loved Me in preparation for this video, though I've also seen Octopussy and a few other of the Moore films. And I guess my biggest issue with Roger Moore's James Bond is that he feels like he's taking his films as a bit of a joke. And I think he by far plays the least serious and most comedic iteration of this British spy. And there is inherently an over-the-top aspect to the character with how ridiculous some of his gadgets and the action set pieces are, but Moore just took it a little too far in my opinion, as he's the least slick and sophisticated of all the live-action James Bond portrayals, and almost breaks the fourth wall quite often. For me personally, I think the 2 most integral aspects of Bond is his charismatic personality and the physicality he brings to the role. Essentially, the actor's ability to make me believe that he could really whoop some serious ass. And on both accounts, I think Roger Moore is just a little lacking. Now, in all fairness to Moore, I do think it's not necessarily his fault, as the directors of his films were likely trying to differentiate his Bond from that of Connery. But in terms of aging gracefully, I do think taking your movies seriously inherently makes your performance in films hold up far better. Coming in 4th place of my James Bond ranking is a shocker to me, but it is Pierce Brosnan. Now, I grew up watching the Brosnan movies as I am a millennial, but for the scripting purposes of this video I rewatched GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. And while I do think Brosnan plays a more physical and suave version of James Bond than Roger Moore did, I do think Pierce Brosnan also plays the least unique version of James Bond. He kind of comes off like an AI-generated version of a classic James Bond. He feels the most like a caricature of what a standard Bond would act like. And it's not his fault per se, he isn't the one who wrote a very fantastical and generic script for 3 of his 4 movies, but in hindsight now that I'm an adult, his movies largely feel like uninspired outings. Movies just made to capitalize off of and keep the James Bond IP alive. Now, I do have great appreciation for the foundational aspects of James Bond as a character, so I don't find Brosnan to be a poor James Bond by any means, and he does have a fairly natural, sleek, and badass energy to him that is very integral to being a good 007. I just feel like Pierce is a great example of good casting with poor execution. The bronze medal of my list is going to Timothy Dalton. And I think Dalton is the most complicated and interesting actor to discuss as this iconic character. Now, I'm actually going to make an entire separate video analyzing Dalton as Bond, so I won't go into extreme detail here, but Dalton plays by far the most grounded, dark, and gritty version of 007. Especially in License to Kill, he is a disciplined and focused man on a mission. He isn't a famous borderline celebrity, just a spy trying to do his job that he feels he's morally obligated to fulfill. But where Dalton's more psychologically driven movies falter is the fact that these are still late 80s action films. We still have dated effects, wacky gadgets, and over-the-top set pieces. So there's a tonal clash in both Dalton movies that just kind of feels weird. I guess I'd say that Dalton's James Bond feels the least like James Bond out of all of the live-action 007s. And on one hand, I can appreciate the more grounded take on the character, and it felt like a very welcome change amongst my Bond binge watch. But it also meant that some of my favorite aspects of the character were somewhat lost in Dalton's performance. Now, if you made it this far, you've likely realized that my favorite James Bond has come down to Connery and Craig. And this is likely not a huge surprise to anyone, as these are two of the most common picks for best 007. But after rewatching a dozen plus James Bond films, I fully understand why. So without further ado, my silver medal is going to Daniel Craig. Now, I've seen every Daniel Craig Bond film, but for this video I specifically rewatched Casino Royale and Skyfall. Because, well, they're not only the best Craig movies, but they're the best James Bond movies overall. And I think I'd best describe Daniel Craig's take on the character as a hybrid of Connery and Dalton. He is the classic smooth-talking James Bond persona of Connery, yet the determination and dark undertones of Timothy Dalton's Bond. And I think these two things come together and form an awesome marriage. Add in the advanced technology of modern filmmaking and a heightened emphasis placed on the physicality of the role, and you have a flat-out great James Bond. But the reason that Daniel Craig just barely missed out on being my favorite James Bond is because I feel like he isn't always the most integral aspect of his movies. Take Skyfall for example. That is a film that in my opinion is hard carried by Javier Bardem and Judi Dench. Their dynamic is in a lot of ways the emotional core of the film and the most interesting narrative element. Craig is not bad in the movie, far from it, but I can't help but feel that any of the Bond actors could have been placed in his position and the film would be just as good. So I do think it is important to have a separation between best Bond movies and best Bond actor. It's for this very reason that I think Michael Keaton is the best Batman. Sure, the Dark Knight trilogy blows Batman 89 and Batman Returns out of the water in terms of film quality, but that doesn't mean Christian Bale is automatically better in the role of Bruce Wayne than Keaton was. And I do think my pick for best James Bond is the most integral aspect of all of his movies within this franchise, and just brings a higher level of charisma to the character. So rather obviously, this means I've gone with Sean Connery as my pick for best James Bond. Now, Sean Connery had the benefit of being the first 007, and he really established a lot of the key components of the character in live action. Mr. Connery had an on-screen presence that no other Bond has been able to fully capture in my opinion. His films were made in the 1960s, so the action and effects are not nearly what we get in the Craig movies, and Daniel Craig does bring superior physicality to the role. But what ultimately puts Connery over the top for me is that he is hard carrying all of these movies. There's no all-time standout villain performances or incredible CGI spectacle that is aiding his efforts. His movies largely rely on Connery's gravitas and screen presence. Without Connery's larger-than-life portrayals, I genuinely think Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger would go from some of the best Bond films to some of the most boring. While Connery is a little lacking in terms of his physicality, his go-to is to either use a clever gadget or hit someone in the face with a good old haymaker. I think he does just enough to make me buy into his physical capabilities as a super spy. And the effortless charismatic banter that he brings to the role is just so foundational for this iconic character. When I think of James Bond, having seen almost every one of these movies multiple times at this point, the first person I think of is Sean Connery. And a really important aspect of the character that most people tend to overlook or ignore is that James Bond isn't supposed to be a quote-unquote good person. He's supposed to be, at least as Fleming intended in his novels, a kind of thuggish sociopath. Like, yes, Connery indulges with the ladies and the finer things in life, but when push comes to shove, he is a cold and calculated man who serves his country above all else. And this is a really important aspect of being an elite spy. You kind of have to have a little bit of a lack of humanity in a way. And when it comes down to it, I do think Daniel Craig played a far more human and vulnerable James Bond. Which on first glance you might think is a good thing, but in my opinion, when it comes to being the best James Bond, you need a little sociopath in you, a willingness to do whatever it takes no matter the moral cost. And for these reasons, Sean Connery is the Screen Story certified pick for best James Bond. Well, if you made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Who do you think the best live-action James Bond of all time is? I personally don't think we've gotten a bad James Bond yet, so I think there's a decent argument for each and every one of them. Now, I've made a few other videos in this style where I try to determine which actor played the best version of an iconic character, and a playlist with all of them will be linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider dropping a like and subscribing for more Screen Stories content. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.